Otway, your host for this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum, brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. In this conversation, we're talking with Dr. Amanda Ryman about the risks and consequences of using cannabis with alcohol. To everyone joining us on this live forum, please share, post, and tag a friend on Facebook to have them join this conversation. If you're on YouTube, share the link so others can join us as well. During the forum, we want you to send us your questions in the comment box, and we'll do our best to have Dr. Ryman answer them for you. We also want you to tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comments on YouTube and Facebook after the live program. Your name will be entered into a drawing on June 9th, 2022 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. Dr. Ryman, welcome to the forum. We're excited to have you as our guest today. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role as the Vice President of Public Policy Research at New Frontier Data and the founder of Personal Plants.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. And hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here talking with you today. So I am a public health researcher, and I'm currently the Vice President of Public Policy Research at New Frontier Data. And we collect data. We collect data on cannabis consumers, on what's happening at the counter in dispensaries, what's happening in the industry, all with the goal of better understanding how cannabis consumption is happening, what we need to keep on our radar in terms of public health behaviors, and how this all translates to what's happening in the cannabis industry. Mm-hmm. So I work primarily on the impacts of policy decisions on use patterns, outcomes related to consumer behavior, and related to industry behavior as well. Mm-hmm. My other passion is helping people develop relationships with plants. I believe that forming relationships with the plants that we plan to consume gives us a better relationship with them and a better time of consumption. Similarly to our food, growing your own fruits and vegetables is a very different experience than buying them at the grocery store. So Personal Plants was designed to help people who want to grow cannabis and other medicinal plants develop those relationships with their medicine and to really discover the joys of growing plants.
Wow. So tell us how you got into the cannabis space.
Oh, goodness. So I was very interested in drug policy from a social justice perspective. My training is as a social worker. And when I was in grad school in Chicago, which is where I'm from, I learned a lot about the different policies related to drug use and who was most impacted by those policies, learning more about how vulnerable communities, people of color, have really borne the brunt of cannabis prohibition and drug prohibition. So I moved to the Bay Area in 2002 to Oakland to start a PhD program at Berkeley in social welfare, because I really felt honestly that as a woman, I needed to have a PhD in order for people to take me seriously and to listen to what I had to say around policy. Yeah. At that time in Oakland and San Francisco and Berkeley, the early 2000s, there was really this medical cannabis revolution happening, and something that we didn't even really know that much about back in Chicago. But when I got to the Bay Area, I saw that there were these dispensaries and that people were becoming medical cannabis patients, accessing dispensaries, and that these dispensaries, more than just cannabis stores, were really centers of community health. And they offered counseling services, legal services, alternative health services, all free of charge to patients. And as a social worker, seeing our healthcare model in the US and knowing that being able to get a free massage when you don't have health insurance doesn't happen very often, right. I thought that this early model of community health at dispensaries was really interesting and likely fleeting. So I decided to study it. And I did my doctoral dissertation on how these medical cannabis dispensaries were operating as health service providers. Mm-hmm. And really the rest is history, because I happened to do this in a time where legalization was really bubbling up to the surface. And a lot of people were interested in how we take this substance that has been prohibited for decades and bring it back into the realm of legitimate healthcare and commerce.
Wow. Well, that's a good point. That segues really good into my next question because I think we should look back at the history of cannabis in America in general, right? So most people really don't realize that, before the current cannabis boom, the medical cannabis boom, the plant was used as medicine legally without restrictions. So can you give us some more context and background on the history of cannabis and how we got to where we are today?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of folks who were born during cannabis prohibition, which is most of us, save for the Gen Zers who,
Right.
are kind of being born into the world today.
Yeah.
So we really think about cannabis as a prohibited plant that has become legal during our lifetime. But the
Right.
reality is the use of cannabis really dates back to around 5000 BC and was always used as a medicine. Every
Right.
piece of evidence we have from cannabis in past use was around some kind of therapeutic or medicinal benefit. Now, that could be relaxation, that could be pain relief, that could be treating certain conditions. But when you look at the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, pretty much all the medicine that was found in medicine cabinets had cannabis in it. Medicine made by Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly,
I didn't
all
know
of
that.
cannabis was a very, very popular ingredient. Now,
Yeah.
a couple things happened in the early 1900s, around 1920s and 30s, that really started to change that. One was we saw an influx of immigration from Mexico after Mexican independence into California, Texas, and other places.
Right.
And then we also saw laws being passed around what the requirements were for putting an ingredient on the medicine bottle.
Hmm.
What the labeling requirements were. Because medicine back in those days, it had cannabis, it also had morphine, and
Yeah.
it had opium, and it had alcohol. And, this was being given to children and given to adults. And so
Mhm.
there was a tightening up of what was defined as a medicine in the United States. At the
Mhm.
same time, you had this new population of people coming into the United States. And, their presence wasn't necessarily welcome for a whole
Right.
host of reasons. That's a whole other show that we could
Yeah.
get into.
Yeah.
But the government decided to take a cue from something that had already worked quite well in California around opium regulation. So
Mhm.
same thing, we had a large influx of Chinese immigrants into San Francisco in the 1800s. The
Mhm.
government wanted a way to keep tabs on these folks without necessarily making their status illegal. So
Wow.
what they did is they saw that they were using opium. Opium was their drug of choice. It was
Yeah.
part of their culture, and that's what they made illegal. So that allowed them to search, seize, go into the private homes of individuals that may be using opium as a
Mhm.
way to kind of keep tabs. Well, they thought this is a great thing to do to the Mexican immigration population as well. So they started to do the same thing. And you started to see local laws like in San Antonio, Texas, and other places pop up around marijuana. Same thing as cannabis, which was
Right.
already in people's medicines. People already knew what that was, but
Yeah.
marijuana was what the Mexicans called it.
Called it.
And
Right.
so it was a great way for people to say, oh, marijuana is not the same as cannabis. Cannabis is the medicine. And marijuana is something that these very dangerous people are using. And so through that process, it became illegal. Finally, with the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, which basically said you need a tax stamp from the government in order to sell cannabis. The government did not give out any tax stamps, therefore virtually making it illegal. And then, of course, with the Controlled Substances Act in the 1970s, which not only codified the legality of cannabis, but it placed it in Schedule 1, meaning
Right.
that it's the most dangerous of any of the substances. And that's the world that we were born into. So we
Right.
were born into the world where cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug, has no medical purpose, is very, very dangerous, can cause all kinds of problems like violence and dependence. And then in the mid 90s, we started to reconsider it as a medicine, primarily because of its use with the HIV/AIDS population in San Francisco and the
Mhm.
very hard and tireless work of the LGBTQ plus population that
Mhm.
worked to allow cannabis use as a medicine for people that were in dire medical need. And that was really the beginning of the tugging of the thread of why is cannabis illegal? What do we really know about it? Are the things we've been told accurate? And if not, what's an appropriate way to regulate this plant? And that's the evolution that folks like you and I have been seeing
Yeah.
since we were pretty much teenagers.
Right. So thank you for that very comprehensive, threading the needle to where we are today, right? So we're seeing we call it the cannabis boom in America, where we're seeing more and more states allowing medical cannabis, adult use, recreational. And it makes me think back to when alcohol was prohibited, right? And we had this series of prohibition and all of that. And then now when prohibition ended with alcohol, it's become part of our lifestyle, right? People drink, they consume, they can just have alcohol whenever they want, right? So it appears that cannabis may be on its way to that kind of same pattern, where at some point it will no longer be on the Schedule 1 drug, right?
I hope so.
Do you think that's going to happen? And do you think that's going to happen soon?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, part of it is up to society, right? So how fast or slow society decides to incorporate cannabis into their lifestyle, to destigmatize it. There's a huge movement to destigmatize cannabis use among populations that have generally been over stigmatized for using, including older folks, people that are full-time workers, mothers, I would say, a group that has been highly stigmatized for all kinds of substance use, that is really speaking out about how cannabis helps them. So as long as these conversations keep evolving, I do think it will become more integrated. But of course, the federal illegality is going to be a barrier as long as it exists. And it's a barrier because there's no interstate commerce. The industry really can't correctly evolve as an industry, but also because there's consumers out there that either live in states where it's illegal or live in states where it's legal, but its federal illegality is still a barrier to them because, maybe they just don't want to break the federal law, or maybe they work for the military, or they're in a job where they're getting drug tested, or where state cannabis laws are not honored in the grand scheme of things. So I think that, yes, normalization is happening to a point, but until we get it removed from the schedule at the federal level and get federal legalization to happen, I think that it will continue to have some barriers to being completely integrated into our lifestyles the way alcohol is. In terms of when that's going to happen, my federal legalization estimation for a while now has been 2025.
Yeah.
So I'm sticking with that, which is getting closer. I mean,
it's getting closer.
Like 2016, and it was like, oh my God, that's 9 years away, and now it's like tomorrow. So
exactly. So let's kind of segue in. We talked about the history of cannabis. We talked about prohibition with alcohol ending, but now we're seeing these conversations around the connection between alcohol and cannabis. So let's start with, what's the relationship between the two? From your perspective?
I mean, I think one thing is that they're both used for relaxation. They're both used in social settings. They're both better for adults to use, right? So we have reasons why we don't want young people to be consuming these products, but young people do also consume these products. I think that they're both have a cultural attachment to them. So whether that's the type of celebration or the type of people that are celebrating, I think that is very common in both alcohol and cannabis. And I think it's also part of popular culture. I think, movies and songs and, other things that kind of mark something as being a pop culture icon are true for both cannabis and alcohol. And then they also have very long histories of use for many different reasons. For spiritual reasons, for health reasons. And I think they also both pose risks if not used mindfully and responsibly, although those risks diverge in some very important ways that we'll get into.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And, what happens when you kind of mix the two together?
All right, let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. I know that's what people want to know. They're like, Amanda, I got a barbecue to go to this weekend. I need these answers. So I think, I'm going to start off by saying, from a public health perspective and from a social work perspective, the best answer is probably do not mix them.
Okay.
The best answer, right? Now, the best answer is also eat 5 servings of vegetables a day and get 8 hours of sleep per night and, exercise at least 3 days a week. Like, those are all the best answers. Very few of us do those things. So I'll start off with the best answer, which is to choose cannabis or alcohol when you decide you're going to imbibe. And the reason I say that is because cannabis and alcohol have what we call a synergistic relationship, which means it's a 1 + 1 = 4 scenario. Not 1 + 1 = 2, not an additive where it's cannabis plus alcohol. It's that when you add them together, they enhance the effects of each other.
Right.
And that's really where folks have to be careful. And the order in which you consume them also makes a difference. Wow. And so I think that's important for folks to know. So I'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, let's go through that.
So cannabis can enhance the effects of alcohol. It can also delay the effects of alcohol. And alcohol can enhance the effects of cannabis. So that's when I call that synergistic relationship. So let's say that you drink alcohol first, right? Let's say that you have had a few beers, you're at a party, and now someone's passing a joint and you decide to imbibe. Be very careful. This is probably the most dangerous situation for people, is when they have a lot of alcohol on board and then they consume cannabis. That's when you get what you hear about greening out, or crossfading, which means that because alcohol makes the cannabis effect stronger, it's like boom. I mean, it's like hitting you fast and hard. And so if you already have alcohol on board, that can mean nausea. It can mean, anxiety and panic. It can mean feeling lightheaded or dizzy, and just generally not feeling well. So, if you have had a bit to drink, maybe more than you're used to, or even maybe more than a drink, be really, really, really careful with bringing cannabis on board. Now, the thing about cannabis, as we haven't talked about yet, but will, is that you cannot fatally overdose from cannabis.
Right.
So even if you've had one drink and then you smoke cannabis and you feel really sick, it's not a fatal overdose that is happening. You're not going to feel well. You should have some water. If you're in the sun, get out of the sun, have some food, relax. Put something on TV or music that relaxes you, that makes you feel really calm and comfortable, and know that it will pass.
Okay.
If you've only had 1 or 2 drinks, you do not have enough alcohol in you for an alcohol overdose. Okay. Now, if you have had 6, 7 drinks, right? It's like one of those parties.
Yeah.
Then you decide to consume cannabis and you get really sick. Then I would also consider whether or not the alcohol is playing a role there. Regardless of the cannabis, right? Alcohol on its own can present with a lot of those same symptoms from alcohol poisoning. So, if you have 7 drinks and you're feeling drunk but okay, and then you have cannabis and you get really sick, do not discount the impact of the alcohol on that outcome. Now, if we flip them.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happens if you flip it?
Yeah, if you flip it, if you start with the cannabis and then you use the alcohol. Now, we don't have a lot of research on this direction. But what we do know is it's possible that cannabis will delay the effect of the alcohol. Oh. So you might have a little sip, or maybe you have a drink and you're like, oh, I don't really feel drunk. And so you have more, but it might hit you later on.
Okay.
Now, what I have personally found on this is just an N=1 anecdotal study here, folks, is I have personally found that if I consume cannabis and then alcohol, I feel the alcohol more intensely. So 1 drink is like enough, right? Wow. When maybe before I'd have 1.5.
Yeah.
So it is possible that consuming cannabis first might reduce the amount of alcohol that you consume, but it also may delay the effect, which is just a reason to be really careful. Now, one other last thing I'll say is about the novice consumer. Because for the novice consumer, the direction it usually goes is the first one. For the novice consumer, because alcohol lowers inhibition.
Right.
For someone that's newer to cannabis, it's usually that they have some drinks and then someone presents a joint. And even though they wouldn't usually smoke it, they decide now's the time to try it for the first time because they've had a few drinks in them. Do not do that.
Okay.
Do not do that. If this is your first time consuming cannabis, consume it without anything else on board. Trust me. Because the thing about cannabis is it leaves an imprint. Your experience with cannabis leaves an imprint. And we'll talk a bit about edibles and how that changes things up. But people who consume too much cannabis their brain doesn't really forget that. And so if you have a bad experience mixing cannabis and alcohol, especially if it's your first time with cannabis, it's very possible that will impact further future sessions.
Wow.
And you may not want that because maybe you want to use it for pain or for sleep. But now every time you use it, it reminds you of that really terrible experience you had because you were drunk.
Yeah.
It's not worth it. So best thing, don't mix them.
Yeah.
If you are going to mix them, I recommend you try the cannabis first and then
Yeah.
have a little bit of alcohol if you really want to add alcohol. If you do alcohol first, I'd really recommend no cannabis unless you're very experienced.
Right.
And if it's your first time, do not consume after you've been.
Don't do it. Okay. Well, I have a bazillion questions because that was just really good information. So what if you had, what if you choose what's better, a beer or bourbon mixed with cannabis, right? Because, they're both different types of alcohol. So does it matter what type of alcohol you have?
So there's two answers to this. One goes back to what we learned in like junior high or high school, right? 12 ounces of beer equals 5 ounces of wine equals 1 ounce of liquor. Still applies. Right. So think of it as a drink. So if you are saying, I want to consume a joint and a drink, that is a beer or 5 ounces of wine or 1 ounce of liquor. So it doesn't really matter the type of alcohol for that as much as it matters how much alcohol you're consuming. And be mindful that if you have a triple bourbon, that's 3 drinks that you are now combining with cannabis versus 1 drink that you are combining with cannabis. So that's something to be really, wary about. You definitely don't want to add too much. Now, the second piece is that people are pairing them. So just like wine and food, you see pairings, you see events where people are pairing specific alcohol, wine, bourbon, beer with specific strains of cannabis because they have complementary terpene profiles or flavonoid profiles. But these are highly curated experiences that are usually people that are way more experienced with cannabis. But there is kind of that aspect of craft pairing of these two substances. But for most folks, it's really paying attention to how much alcohol is in what you're consuming.
Yeah, well, we're based in Florida, and I don't think I've ever heard what you just referenced. So that must be a California thing.
Oh, California, Chicago, New York, Albuquerque, Phoenix, Denver. Wow. It's happening.
Yeah, well, we in Florida, we only are allowed to have medical cannabis legally.
I know.
Recreational. No. So if you're doing that in Florida, it's illegal. Just saying. Throwing it out there. So we have a question that just came in from Mahogany Review asking, what is the effect of mixing alcohol and cannabis edibles? So that makes me go into that conversation about, okay, what about the pairings of alcohol with different types of cannabis? So can you answer that question?
Absolutely. And that's a great question because, you're going to a party or an event and you may not be smoking. Right? Maybe you have some gummies in your purse, or maybe somebody offers you half a pot brownie. And what effect is that going to have? That really has to do with time of onset. Mm-hmm. So when you smoke cannabis or when you ingest through inhalation, it could be smoking, it could be vaping. And y'all can see me, so I can do this with my hands. The onset is fast. You feel it pretty much right away when you smoke or vape. It lasts for about 20 minutes and then you start to come down. So if you're at a party and you consume cannabis 2 hours before, and now you're like, should I have a beer? You can pretty much tell where your intoxication level is if you're not going to consume any more cannabis. But edibles are different. Edibles have a much slower onset. It can take up to 2 hours to feel an edible. And then once you're at that peak of intoxication, you're there for much longer. You're not there for just 20 minutes. You could be there for 6-7 hours, depending on the strength of the edible and your own metabolism and experience with cannabis. So be really aware of that if you're going to mix with alcohol. If you eat a cookie and then 30 minutes later, you're like, I don't really feel much from that cookie. I'm going to have a glass of wine. Be aware that in 30 more minutes, you may be an entire cookie and an entire glass of wine's worth of intoxicated. And you don't yet know what that looks like because you haven't hit your intoxication level with the edible. So if you're going to mix edibles with alcohol and you want to take the edible first, wait a good 2 hours before adding any alcohol because you really want to know what the effect of that edible is before you add alcohol. And then be aware that that edible could delay the effect of the alcohol. So it's really about timing. And again, that's why I think spacing it out, if you have a gummy, kind of in the afternoon and then you get to dinner time and you're like, all right, it's dinner time, and now I'm going to have food and I'm going to have a beer with my dinner, that's probably a safe way to think about it.
Okay. That what you just said segues right into my next question, which is, what stays in the body longer, cannabis or alcohol?
Well, if you're talking about intoxication, how long you stay
Oh,
intoxicated, it could
yeah.
be cannabis. So if you have an edible and you're intoxicated for 7 hours, that could definitely be longer than with a beer. However, from drug testing perspective, cannabis stays in your system much longer. So
How long? For those who aren't familiar with it.
So
okay.
That's the thing, is you don't really know, because it depends on how often you consume. It depends on your body fat content. It depends on your metabolism, because cannabis is stored in the fat. So if you consume cannabis on a Friday at an event, and then you get a drug test on a Tuesday, the next Tuesday, even though you're definitely not intoxicated still from a Friday night, even if you had a very big edible, still not going to be intoxicated on Tuesday, you could still test positive for cannabis. Now, the rule of thumb among people that are regular consumers, so I would include medical consumers in that, right? Because medical consumers are consuming regularly. The rule of thumb is to give it a good 6 weeks before feeling like you would be absolutely clean for a drug test. Now, this also could be impacting whether if you get pulled over. So, you have some cannabis on a Saturday, and then the following Wednesday you get pulled over for speeding, and the officer decides that they need to give you a blood test for drugs. You could come up positive for cannabis. So just really something to think about and consider if you're someone that's subject to drug tests, if you're someone that gets pulled over frequently for all kinds of reasons, that cannabis will be on board with you even after you are no longer intoxicated. Now, some states have a nanogram limit for THC in the blood that determines DUI of like 4 nanograms. But research on driving while using cannabis shows that a nanogram limit really isn't a scientifically valid way to measure intoxication, because medical cannabis consumers can have that much or more in their blood all the time, even when they're not intoxicated. So field sobriety is still the best way to test whether somebody's intoxicated, but just be aware that just because you're not intoxicated presently on cannabis does not mean it's not in your system and that you couldn't get in trouble for having it there.
Wow. That's good to know, folks. If you're listening and watching, remember that. So before we do the show, we have people who register for the show and they send in some questions. So I have a question from Antonetta, who wanted to know if cannabis works for alcohol addiction.
That's a great question, Antoinetta. So I would say it is a potential way for people to reduce or eliminate their alcohol use. One of many, many, many ways that exist. And that's the thing about substance use, is that there are a lot of ways to reduce or eliminate your substance use that are not necessarily 12-step or abstinence based, even though those work for a lot of people. And I don't want to knock those programs, because again, everybody's different. But there are people who have found success in reducing or eliminating their alcohol use by switching to cannabis through harm reduction. Now, one interesting thing about cannabis is when you look at alcohol withdrawal symptoms, which tend to be spasms or tremors of the muscles, difficulty sleeping, irritability, depression, loss of appetite. Those are all symptoms that we have scientific evidence showing cannabis to be beneficial for. So I think there's one piece of it, which is, can cannabis be used as a withdrawal medication for people that are trying to reduce or eliminate alcohol and are going through withdrawal symptoms? Yes, I do think it can be used for that. Can it be used long-term as a substitute for people that want to reduce or eliminate their alcohol use? People say it has worked for them. Not everyone. Again, everybody's different. But for some people, the ability to use cannabis instead of alcohol, or to use less alcohol because they can also use cannabis, has been successful. Now, out here in California, we actually have a term for it. It's called Cali Sober, which means that you do consume cannabis, but you do not consume other substances. And we have self-help groups and other groups of people that are specifically trying to use cannabis as a harm reduction tool to reduce or eliminate their use of alcohol. Now, cannabis has risks associated with it as well as just everything. However, as I mentioned, there's no risk of fatal overdose with cannabis, which there is with alcohol. There's a higher risk of accidental overdose mixing alcohol with opiates than would happen with cannabis. And the dependence level and potential for cannabis is less than with alcohol. So there's reasons why somebody might want to choose cannabis instead of alcohol. But if someone has alcohol dependence, then there's a lot of different options, cannabis being one of them for trying to address that behavior.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. So I want to shift a little bit to the growing use of CBD, which is another form of cannabis that doesn't have a lot of the THC, which causes the high. So what is the impact of consuming CBD and alcohol?
So, CBD is a cannabinoid and it binds to our cannabinoid receptors. So we have an endocannabinoid system, which is similar to our nervous system. And it regulates a lot of body processes like sleep, anxiety, sex, drive, appetite, all the good things, right?
Yeah.
And so we just discovered that we had an endocannabinoid system in the mid-90s. So the research on this is still pretty nascent. But what we do know is that our bodies have receptors all through them called endocannabinoid receptors. And the cannabinoids from the plant fit perfectly into these receptors. So when we look at the reasons why cannabis has so many medical benefits, it's because there's so many places in our body that rely on cannabinoids in order to function properly. So introducing cannabinoids from the plant helps facilitate this. So all of that is to say that CBD, THC, CBN, CBG, all of the cannabinoids that we're now looking at and discovering, and there's about 90 or more of them in the cannabis plant, bind to these receptors in our bodies. So when we talk about the effect of CBD with alcohol, it's not going to be that different than with THC and alcohol when it comes to CBD potentially delaying the effect of alcohol. So if we say that cannabis may delay the effect of alcohol, CBD may also delay the effect of alcohol because it's binding to the same receptors as THC. However, because CBD is non-intoxicating, the greening out, the crossfading, the issues that you have with marrying the intoxication of cannabis with the intoxication of alcohol, you will not have with CBD. So, you might have a CBD pill or tincture or edible.
Or a gummy. Yeah, the gummies are big here. Yeah,
right,
edible. Yeah.
And then want to have some alcohol. Just be aware that it could delay the effect of that alcohol. So you could have a drink and feel like, oh, I feel great, and have another one. And then an hour later, you're like, whoa, I should have only had one drink. So similarly to THC-rich cannabis, I would wait until you're certain that you kind of have experienced that CBD product and then go to alcohol. But you're not going to have the same crossfade or green out concerns that you do with THC.
Would that be the same for the growing number of alcoholic drinks that are coming on the market that are infused with CBD?
Okay, so I really hope there's nobody who makes one of those drinks listening because I think it's a bit of a gimmick. The reality is CBD is a very beneficial cannabinoid and it helps with inflammation. It can help bones regrow. It can help with anti-cancer properties. CBD, I think we've just really scratched the surface about all the medical benefits, but CBD, 10 milligrams of CBD in your alcoholic beverage. It's like a screwdriver now infused with 10 milligrams of vitamin C. It's like, good. I like vitamin C. I know it's good for my body, but at this point, I think they're doing it because they can, because the law is not telling them they can't do it. And it's a way to market to people that are interested in CBD and think it's a little edgy to have an alcoholic beverage with CBD in it. But I don't know.
Okay. Well, we're getting a lot of questions coming in from our audiences, and we actually got a couple of the same questions along the same lines about the impact of marijuana on the brain. So let's bring up the question from Alan Draw. about, he says, have studies been done on the effect of cannabis on people's cognitive abilities, in particular, short and long-term memory? And we also got the same question from Alexandris, who sent a question in before the show asking the same thing. How does cannabis affect short and long-term memory?
Well, that's a great question. And it's definitely one of the questions I think is a little bit of a remnant from kind of the prohibition days, because one of the big messages we got was that cannabis made you stupid, cannabis made you lazy, cannabis made you forget things. And a lot of the characters that we saw on TV, Jeff Spicoli in Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Cheech and Chong, their characters were very forgetful, and they were like, where did I leave my keys, man? And where I'm like, all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's definitely been a lot of association with that. From a research perspective, we do not see any long-term cognitive impact from cannabis use, long-term. So, people that have been using cannabis for a long time, we don't see them with higher rates of dementia. We don't see them with higher rates of Alzheimer's. We don't see them with higher rates of cognitive deficits later in life. In fact, we also see evidence that cannabis can be a neuroprotectant, that it might actually help regrow brain pathways that have been damaged by things like traumatic brain injury and Alzheimer's. Very, very early research. The NFL is actually spearheading some of this research into traumatic brain injury because of the impact that their sport has on these individuals. So I think there's a lot to learn there. Now, short-term memory. Yes, it does impact short-term memory. And I call that the kind of like, I walked into this room, what did I come in here for type of memory that I also have as a middle-aged person, right? So it does have that impact. However, that impact does not persist. So once you stop using cannabis or once you sober up, you're not like that as a person now. It's definitely something that the cannabis intoxication does to someone, but it's not something that persists. Now, the caveat to this is younger people, because we hear a lot about kind of the developing brain and that our brains don't develop completely until we're in our early 20s. And what is the impact of cannabis use on, quote, the developing brain? And the reality is we still really don't know. The research that we've seen on that is taking cross-sectional snapshots in time and is saying cannabis users' brains look different than non-cannabis users' brains, but we don't know if that translates into anything. We don't know if that means that they're not functioning as well. There's so much going on in adolescence that is connected to psychological, social, and physical functioning that it's really hard to parse out the impact of cannabis as correlational or causational at that moment in time. But I will say this about younger use. They shouldn't do it, right? So cannabis is not recommended for younger people. There's absolutely the potential that it could impact the way that the brain is developing in the teenage years. That's why we recommend that nobody try cannabis until they're 21, right, in their early 20s. But we also know that, like I mentioned, there's so many complicated things happening in the life of an adolescent that my perspective as a social worker is that if your adolescent is consuming cannabis any more than just, oh, I experimented at this party once, like, don't get mad at me kind of experimentation, there's something else going on in their life besides cannabis that needs attention. Because the desire for a young person to check out emotionally or psychologically by using cannabis habitually is in response to something. So it's important that even though some of the kind of immediate reaction is like, oh my God, you're using cannabis and I'm going to yell at you and I'm going to ground you and tell you can't go out with your friends and you can't play on the team anymore. I think that that's a very natural reaction. But I think a more important reaction is, what's happening in your life that you want to check out this much? What pain are you experiencing that you are needing to use this plant this often in order to handle it? And I think that's an important but harder conversation for parents to have than just the, forget about going to the soccer game this Friday, because there's something underlying that. So I would say for adolescents, pay attention to what's going on behind the use. Definitely discourage use until people are in their 20s. And then after that, there's really not much concern about cognitive impact. But, again, everybody's different. So I go back to, if you're not having a good time, if cannabis is not serving you, if you're using it and feeling worse, if you're using it and finding that you don't like the impacts it's having in your life, then address that. And that's going to look different for everyone. So I think it's mindfulness about, is this contributing to your life in the way you want? And if the answer is no, then maybe a change has to happen.
Yeah. So for those who are listening and, they're consuming cannabis, they're consuming alcohol, you know, they may be experiencing what you're talking about. They're doing it for a reason, right? Some underlying reason. Do you have any resources or educational links or information that you can share with our listeners and viewers that they can go to get some help?
Yeah, well, the Harm Reduction Coalition is really great. And they have a lot of resources for people that embrace this concept of harm reduction. And, just quickly, the concept of harm reduction is that drugs can absolutely cause harm in people's lives. And there's ways to reduce that harm without demanding abstinence from drugs, that there are ways people can make their lives better without saying, well, I can just never use this drug again. Because that promise to never use something again is a big turnoff to a lot of folks who want help. And it's also a big reason why people relapse, because they get into this all or nothing idea about what recovery looks like. So the Harm Reduction Coalition is a really great place to start. And then if you're looking for more information about cannabis use as a medicine, I always go back to Americans for Safe Access. They're the oldest patient advocacy organization in the country. They were founded back in 2002. They have chapters in every state, and they're very medically focused. So for folks in Florida that want to know more about cannabis, using cannabis for certain conditions, what the specific laws say about medical cannabis use in your state, they are a wonderful, wonderful resource.
Yeah, and we also have the Florida Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use here in Florida that we always encourage people to go to learn about the qualifying conditions, how to get a medical marijuana card, and again, everything that you need to know about cannabis consumption legally in the state of Florida. And of course, the Mary website, if you also want to get some information. So Dr. Ryman, we're getting a couple more questions here. And this one is actually going into what is the effect of cannabis and psychotropic drug combo use? Can we pull that question up? So, and we did get a couple of questions from folks asking about mixing cannabis with other things. So let's do it this one. And then I want to segue into another question we got about mixing cannabis with other substances. So
that's a great question. So when we talk about cannabis and psychotropic medication, so we're talking about things like anti-anxiety medication, anti-depression medication, anything really for mental health, I think the answer there is proceed with caution. When it comes to cannabis and mental health, there's a lot of variability there. And for some people, it helps them a whole lot. And for some people, it exacerbates their symptoms, not unlike psychotropic medications. So, when we talk about people that are trying to find the right anti-anxiety medication, it can take a few tries. And some of them might make their symptoms worse and some might make them better. And it's really a matter of finding the right one for them. And cannabis is no different. So I think really the key here is talk to your doctor. Talk to your doctor. And, honestly, I think one of the biggest benefits of changing prohibition and of having access to medical and adult use cannabis is that the destigmatization leads to open conversations between people and their physicians. So if you're working with a mental health provider and you are working on finding the right psychotropic medication, mention your cannabis use. Talk about what it's helped with, what it hasn't helped with. If you want to continue using cannabis while you're using your psychotropic medications, be really clear about that with your doctor, and then be really mindful of the impact of that use. So there's a whole host of really great tools out there for people that want to journal and take note of their use of different products and how it's impacting them. One that I recommend is called Tetragram. It's an app that you can download and you can enter the product that you use, the symptom you're trying to treat, if it helped, how much it helped, and then your doctor will actually be able to access that information as well. So you can sit down with them and they can say, oh, gee, you tried this strain and your anxiety went through the roof. Let's make sure that we don't use that again. And, after you took your Zoloft, you had this effect with your cannabis. Let's talk about that. So really, you have to be your own researcher and investigator because everyone is so different around how they react to cannabis. But I would say be very careful, be very open with your doctor, and then keep track of how it's impacting you. Because I do know people that have replaced all of their psychotropic medications with cannabis. I know people who are using both together and are finding the combinations working really well. And I know people for whom cannabis made their symptoms a lot worse. Wow. So it's really going to be a little bit of trial and error, but make sure your doctor's on board as a partner with you in that.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ryman, before we close up, are there any closing thoughts, comments that you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers when it comes to cannabis use and alcohol?
Oh, goodness. Well, cannabis is not a vice. And I think it's important to say that because I do consider alcohol a vice. I mean, yes, I think it provides relaxation and it can help with sleep, which are definitely therapeutic uses. But I do not think alcohol is a medicine. I think it is fun for some people. I think it is a way to imbibe and relax and celebrate and have cultural experiences and social experiences. But I think cannabis is a medicine. And even for people that are using it for what we would call quote unquote recreational purposes, it's still providing therapeutic benefit. And I think it firmly belongs in the field of a therapeutic tool. So even though, it can be at parties and it can be used in that way, I would really encourage people not to lump it together with alcohol, to think about it as a wellness tool that they may be using to reduce their social anxiety before they go to a party, or reduce the pain in their feet so that they can stand at an event all night. And really thinking about it that way. And then, if alcohol happens to come on board, think about the cannabis you've already consumed and how alcohol does or does not add to that. Interestingly, the younger generation is drinking less than generations past. And I think part of that is because they have access to cannabis.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for those closing thoughts. And thank you for being a guest on this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Research and Education Initiative at Florida A&M University. Thank you to everyone watching this program. Tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comment boxes on YouTube and Facebook after this live program. If you complete the survey, your name will be entered into a drawing on June 9th, 2022 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. We want to encourage you to go to the Florida Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use website to learn more about legal medical marijuana in the state of Florida and how to obtain a use card. We also encourage you to go to the Florida A&M University Mary website to learn more about this initiative, its educational programs, and additional information about cannabis use in Florida. Thank you, and y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.